Sinkler's Ridge, Tennessee, December 23rd, 1864. Early morning. We know General Forrest and his cavalry are out there. But will he come? Will he ever come? And if he does, shall we be ready? When we went into camp 2 days ago, Major Charles Shaw held the command for our detachment. Major Shaw died last night, struck down not by rebel fire, but by fever. I, Lieutenant Isaiah Fitzhenry, command this detachment now. The mission is in my hands. Our book opens with Jake arriving home after an exhausting bit of animorphing. While they've stopped World War III a while back, the Animorphs are now working overtime to try and slow things down, try and delay the inevitable open invasion of Earth. They've pretty much given up on school. I assume the Chi are covering for them there, and the only moment of rest they get are when they have to go home to keep up appearances. So you can imagine Jake's feelings when, the second he gets home, his mom rushes up and tells him that he has to clean the basement now, because we're putting up a rec room at the last minute. This is not a drill. Rec room, rec room, rec room. So while Jake is going through old boxes of fridge art and science fair projects, he comes across a box of the stuff left to Jake when Grandpa G died back in number 31, The Conspiracy. Inside, Jake finds an old journal belonging to one Isaiah Fitzhenry, Grandpa G's great-great-uncle, who fought in the American Civil War. Jake turns to its final pages, beginning with the entry dated December 23rd, 1864. About a paragraph in, Jake gets distracted, puts the book down, and gets back to the basement duties, and thus kicks off this book's main gimmick. Half this book is Jake's adventure, and the other half is the story of Lieutenant Isaiah Fitzhenry fighting on the side of the Union in the Civil War. We switch between the two stories every couple of chapters like this is a Megamorphs book, but for this review I've decided to separate the two narratives and look at them one at a time. This first part will focus on Fitzhenry's story, while part 2 will discuss Jake's story and how the two stories interact with each other. This book marks the 5th and final book ghostwritten by statistically everyone's favorite ghostwriter, Ellen Giroux, though I suspect that out of her 5 books, this is the one she had the least to do with. According to Kay Applegate, this book was largely a passion project for Michael Grant, who was heavily studying the Civil War at the time. I can't confirm this, but I highly suspect that Ellen Giroux worked pretty exclusively on the Jake side of things. Sadly, after all this time, I am still unable to find her or anything about her, and she may remain one of the most mysterious creative forces behind Animorphs. Ellen Giroux, if by some miracle you're watching this, contact me. I'd really like to speak with you. Now, historical fiction. Not really a genre we've covered in great detail on this show. Sure, the Animorphs have dabbled in time travel, but that was mostly so that George Washington could cameo in some wacky sci-fi adventures. There are no sci-fi elements in Fitzhenry's story, and no connection to the plot of Animorphs outside of this guy being a really distant relative to Jake. Its ties to the other plot are purely thematic, though how successful at it we'll discuss later. Now, I'm not coming from a place of authority here. Historical fiction is not my genre of choice, and I'm not sure what the typical taboos are for fans of this genre, like, where the line is for changing the real-life history to fit the narrative. The way I see it, I am fine with the introduction of fictional characters and conflicts in real-life historical settings, just as long as its artifice is clear, that it isn't presenting itself as something that actually for real happened. It also helps if the new characters and conflicts introduced are minor in comparison to the real deal, which is kind of what we have here, a small battle where the results didn't sway the war one direction or the other. Here's what's weird about this story. The setting is Sinkler's Ridge, Tennessee, a small rail town that represents a rail line that's used to ship supplies to Union troops. Sinkler's Ridge doesn't exist. It's a fictional town for this story. Fitzhenry is also fictional. He took over this command after the death of Major Charles Shaw, who is, you guessed, fictional. But here's the kicker. This town and the little group of soldiers protecting it are under threat of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a very real guy. A little background. Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of the wealthiest men in America at the time, making his fortune from plantations and slave trading, so he had a lot of personal stake on whether or not slavery ended. He wasn't the only one, of course. "Hi, Dealin' Theodore Hawk here, and have I got the slave for you?" When the Civil War broke out, plantation owners were exempt from service, but Forrest enlisted anyway, starting off as a private. Then the higher command went, "Wait, hang on, we can't just let the Bill Gates of slavery be a cannon fodder soldier," so he got swiftly promoted to lieutenant colonel. Forrest was one of the most interesting presences among the Confederate Army. The guy was tall, imposing, and from the bits of his writing I've read, fairly well-spoken and even charismatic. He was a duelist by hobby and made a lot of his kills by the sword, and his troops acted ruthlessly against Union soldiers. He also pumped a lot of his own money into the war, buying supplies, munitions, and even recruitment campaigns. He may also have been the smartest guy among the Confederates. He once ended a raid mission with more soldiers than he started with. Oh, and when the war ended, he became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. I can see why this book goes with him as the villain. Typically, when listing the big Confederate generals, Forrest gets third bill behind Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, which might have been true of history, but in terms of literary value, Forrest might be the Civil War's coolest villain. He was like an evil, racist 19th century Tony Stark, the rich guy who took matters into his own hands and found he was really good at it. It's just too bad that none of this is really communicated in this book. General Forrest is barely present, instead being an unseen phantom that hovers over this small group of Union soldiers, but with one brief exception, nobody really explains why they're so scared of him, and you'll never know if you haven't already done the research yourself. Kind of disappointing, really. So Fitzhenry has a handful of soldiers, many of them sick with fever. Fitzhenry sends a message for new orders, but it never gets to where it's going, because one of Forrest's men managed to cut the telegraph line. The Confederate soldier is captured, but all he does is confirm that General Fuck You Up Forrest is on their doorstep. So Fitzhenry is a very green soldier in charge of 20 or so really sick men. They don't stand a chance unless reinforcements arrive. And they do. Sergeant Rains appeared from behind the hospital tent, his face contorted in alarm and confusion. "There's some men coming into camp, sir." The intensity of his voice stopped my heart. "Forrest?" "Who?" I yelled, falling into a run. "What approach?" "Not sure, sir." "For God's sake, Rains, speak up." "I guess they must be runaway slaves, been hiding up back in the hills." I started to breathe again, annoyed with Rains for getting so excited, for getting me so excited. We had no time for distractions. This would be a trivial matter, a corporal's job. "What do they want?" I said shortly. "Food?" "No, sir," Rains said weightily. "They say they've come to fight." A laugh escaped me before I could stop it, a nervous mix of surprise and annoyance at a preposterous idea. This is a group of 36 escaped slaves, unofficially led by a man named Jacob. They're dressed in rags and have no weapons, but insist on helping the Union soldiers in their fight to protect the town, an idea that Fitzhenry immediately shoots down. The only thing he's willing to entertain is that these men be contraband, a Civil War term given to escaped slaves used by the Union Army as paid laborers. And while Jacob says they're down for helping dig ditches, they also want to join in the battle. So the question of the day is, why is Fitzhenry, and just about everyone else here, so opposed to the idea of letting these men fight? Black soldiers fighting for the Union was not a new thing by this point. And yet, this is probably an accurate attitude towards said troops. At the start of the Civil War, a lot of people on the side of the Union were opposed to the idea of freed slaves becoming soldiers, including President Abraham Lincoln himself. There were a lot of rationalizations, such as fear concerning the state of slave owners within Union states, a fear that racist white soldiers would protest, and fear that there might be certain physical differences that would be a factor in the effectiveness of black soldiers. All of these excuses were bullshit, of course, and it's a good indicator of American attitudes towards black people at this time. Even if back then you were one of those who truly believed slavery was evil and wrong, that all slaves should be free and the Confederates were a bunch of bellends, you were still capable of treating black people as the other. It's an attitude that can still be seen today, one that says, why aren't you happy with what you've got? Eventually, Lincoln produced the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, changing the legal status of all slaves to free men, and shortly thereafter, the Union Army began officially enlisting black troops into the war effort, eventually making up 10% of the Union Army. Even then, there was discrimination in pay, white soldiers making $1.60 for every dollar black soldiers made, and exactly like Fitzhenry is doing here, more often than not, these black soldiers were disproportionately assigned to labor projects like digging ditches, and didn't get nearly as much frontline time as white soldiers, and yet still wound up with a higher mortality rate than white soldiers. So yeah, not great at all. But by December 1864, black soldiers were a good and proper thing by this point. And yet Fitzhenry won't entertain the idea. We'll dig your defenses, Lieutenant, but when the attack comes, we want to fight. What's your name? I said. It's Jacob. You'll refer to me by rank, I said sharply. Yes, Lieutenant. Surely you know you cannot fight, I said with rising frustration. Surely you know it's impossible. But it's not impossible, Fitzhenry. It would more than double your forces at a time when General Baby Eater Forrest is knocking on your door. And Jacob was referring to you by your rank. Still, the escaped slaves get to work. After this, we get a lot of interactions with minor characters who get one or two scenes and are implied to be important characters, but don't get fleshed out that much. Like Mac, Fitzhenry's buddy who's sick with a fever, or Sally, a local woman who helps tend to the sick that I think they want to tease as a love interest, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Sally and her husband Joe invite Fitzhenry and his officers to a Christmas party, where they eat and party like certain doom isn't right around the corner. They even play some music, and since this is the Civil War, all the songs are now in the public domain, so we can print the lyrics. Private Tweed raised a tambourine. Corporal Fox unsheathed a pair of bones from his jacket pocket. No words were exchanged. They simply joined the town fiddler, then started in on a new song, the words of which I'd heard before. I heard the bugle sound the call of reveille and drill, for water, stable, and tattoo, for taps and all was still. I hear it sound the sick call grim, and see the men in line, with faces wry as they drink down their whiskey and quinine. Sorry, but objection! Yeah, sorry about your period piece, Michael Grant. I'm sure it's lovely, but this just set off my nitpicky research brain. Now, if I had to guess, I would assume that one of the books read as research for this tale was Hardtack and Coffee, or The Unwritten Story of Army Life, which was an 1887 memoir by John D. Billings, a former Union soldier. In it, Billings recounts the day-to-day minutiae of being a Union soldier, from the food to the chores to communication to discipline and entertainment. It's a great book for those researching the Civil War and has been a priceless guide for reenactors. It's been reprinted several times and it's easy to find, and it's just an entertaining read on its own. The authors here would have been foolish not to read this book as part of their research. Now, each of the book's 21 chapters begins with a quote from a poem or song, sometimes credited, sometimes not. That exact verse the characters in number 47 The Resistance sing is the quote that opens chapter 9 of Hardtack and Coffee, a verse which goes uncredited. I'm like 95% certain that's where Kenny Applegate got it, and assumed it was a song sung by Union soldiers during the war. Well, it wasn't. This verse comes from a long 38-verse poem called A Drink from the Old Canteen by a guy named Lieutenant Edward P. Toby. I don't know the exact date this poem was written, but I feel fairly confident that Union soldiers weren't performing it during the war. Why? Because it's a poem remembering the war with an edge of nostalgia. Here's the first 3 verses. My little boy comes bounding in, with wonder in his eyes, and something in his little hand that causes him surprise. "Oh, Papa, Papa, what is this? I found it hid away, up in the attic where I've been this afternoon at play." I look to see what he has got, with careless air and mien, which turn to deepest interest as I see my old canteen. 'Tis worn and covered o'er dirt, its strap is but a string. 'Tis banged and bruised and looks to be a used-up, worthless thing. On many a grand, eventful day I've carried that canteen, and at its sight comes rushing back old memories fresh and green. I tell my boy its name and use, and as he listens well, I take the old, war-worn canteen, and thus its story tell. And then it goes on another 35 verses as the father details his experience during the Civil War. So unless Fitzhenry and his men are time travelers, there's no way they'd be singing this song. The poem was performed at the 3rd annual reunion of the 1st Maine Cavalry Association in September of 1874, an event that was recorded and printed as a 50-odd page book in 1876, which is probably where Billings got the quote, though it's odd he didn't credit the writer. It's like he was doing an uncredited cutaway under the assumption that it fell under fair use laws. What kind of person does that?
He's an asshole.
I'm not really holding this against Kay Applegate, mind you. This is a really obscure poem that I only managed to dig up by quote searching through Google Books, something that did not exist when they were writing number 47, The Resistance. But I highly recommend to any aspiring writer of historical fiction out there to not use unsourced quotes without digging a little deeper. Anyway, back to the Christmas party. The subject of the escaped slaves comes up, and the idea of them joining in the fight, in which host Joe Miller strongly objects to. "You are wrong, Lieutenant," Miller argued. "The people of Sinkler's Ridge are of one mind on this issue." He waved a hand to include the observing group of guests. Heads nod. "If you persist in this absurd support of slaves, you'll find that our support will disappear," Miller said stiffly. At this point, I'd be like, right, well, fuck you guys, we're out. Hey, this place is fictional. It can't have that much strategic value, right? Well, the Christmas party is ruined. Good job, Joe. The next day, Fitzhenry has to juggle the escaped slaves, his officers who don't want to work with them, and the racist townfolk. Jacob proves he's pretty smart when he starts suggesting better places to set up defenses, and they all keep insisting that they want to be part of the fight. But Fitzhenry brings up one of General Cancer Monster Force's most gruesome victories, the massacre at Fort Pillow on April 12, 1864, in which Force's troops murdered surrendering Union troops, mostly African Americans, in cold blood. A terrible war tragedy, undermined by the fact that it happened at a pillow fort. I believe this is meant to be the source of Fitzhenry's hesitance in using the escaped slaves as soldiers, a desire to keep these people alive, instead of being purely motivated by racism. I mean, there's some racism in there. Before the conversation can continue, the first wave of General Skullfucker Force's troops crest the hill and attack Sinkler's Ridge. The battle is frantic. Soldiers scramble, but thankfully the first wave is pretty small, and the Union soldiers manage to beat them back. But not before Fitzhenry is shot in the gut. Thankfully, his belt buckle takes the bullet. It was utterly deformed, nearly cut in two, and folded up around a point at its center. He handed me the buckle, and I saw the flattened lead bullet embedded in the buckle. "You're a lucky man, Lieutenant. That buckle is lead-lined. If Forrest decides to nuke the area, at least your crotch will be protected by radiation." Having witnessed actual violence, Joe Miller and the rest of the citizens of Sinkler's Ridge change their mind about having the black people fight. So we get a scene of these guys training on the use of rifles. And then General Napalm Fart Forrest sends in all his troops. There's a vicious battle, but everyone in Sinkler's Ridge, the townsfolk, the Union soldiers, and the escaped slaves, they're all overrun and killed. This story ends with both Fitzhenry and Jacob shot and dying in the mud on Christmas Day. Sinkler's Ridge is lost. But it's okay, it's fictional, we'll bounce back. Post-war follow-up. The Civil War is an interesting setting for fiction because it doesn't fit into any comfortable narrative. Things like the Revolutionary War and World War II feel as though they have clearly defined boundaries and were being fought for the right reasons, though a lot of those feelings come from how our history classes and pop culture have lionized them. Then you have the messy wars, like World War I and Vietnam. Wars so fucked up that you have a hell of a time romanticizing them. With the Civil War, you had families split apart by state lines, brother fighting brother. The formal European rules of war broke down with the rise of new war technology like the Gatling gun. Nothing ended cleanly. Usually, the only positive people take away from the Civil War was that it ended slavery in America. But even then, certain Americans can't seem to wrap their heads around that. I'm of course referring to ideas like Southern pride and the Confederate flag pasted on everything. People still insisting that the Civil War was fought over state rights in general and not the state's rights to hold slaves specifically. City streets and buildings are named after Confederate generals. General Poop Pits Forrest has his own fan club, with more than one monument being built to him. In 2011, Mississippi almost had his face on their license plates. This is the 21st century. What the hell is wrong with these people? Why are the evils of the Civil War that hard to wrap your head around? Anyway, my impressions after this story are Michael Grant could probably write a pretty good series on the Civil War if he was given room to breathe. But this is an Animorphs book, so let's see what those guys are up to.